Over the past 25 years, the world's population has grown by 2 billion people, from 5.7 to 7.8. The growth has been just over a third. The balance is not inherent in this topic, because the populations have grown differently from country to country. Canadians grew by 8.5 million, Brits by 10 million, but the Chinese, Indians and Nigerians worked hard for the rest of the planet. The Chinese are up 16%, which is 200 million. The Indians are up 43%, which is a whopping 416 million. The Nigerians have had more people than the current German population, plus 98 million, which is almost double the population growth in 25 years. So where does the star of our program, Russia, stand? Its population has fallen by 2.3 million over the past 25 years, a decline of 1.5%. The topic of population growth is multifaceted. It doesn't end with breeding only. Each country has its own reasons and consequences of the current situation, so sit back. We're about to enter the territory of the immoral, because here we will derive the coefficient of how many children should women give birth to, whether there is a demographic pit, and what the economy has to do with it. Before we begin, I'll say that this is going to be a two-part series about the demographic pit in Russia. It demands two parts just because the topic is quite huge. All the figures for the period after the war started and to this day will be in the second part. This video will be centered over the period up to 2020. Let's put aside all those pompous speeches about how each individual is a person with a deep inner world, a unique character and unique experiences. There will soon be 9 billion of us, so for the most part each of us is just a grain of sand on the coast. We can get in the right frame of mind with Henry Ford, who saw man in a special way as a tool for production.
Of these 7,882 specialized jobs, 949 required strong, able-bodied and practically physically perfect men. 3,338 needed men of merely ordinary physical strength. Most of the rest could be performed by women or older children, and we found that 670 could be filled by legless men, 2,637 by one-legged men, 2 by armless men, 715 by one-armed men, and 10 by blind men.
In the economic system, human appears as such an instrument, which can be divided into 3 stages: dependent, worker, and retiree. And in the wet fantasy of economics, a person should be born immediately 16 years old and go to create added value, buy goods on the market and pay taxes to the state. But unfortunately this does not happen, and the economy tolerates the first 16 years of a person's life for sake of the next 50 years of working age, where a person benefits the society. The age after 60 is perceived as a reward for the working age period. So it turns out that this man in the middle takes care of 2 categories at the same time: their dependents, who are also called children, as well as their work provides payment to current retirees, and this is the cycle every person goes through, from birth to death, and only the system remains eternal. So, for the system to function properly, it needs a balance, which means that the population of the country must strive for a normal distribution. That is, when people of all 3 categories are equally distributed, with preferably men and women equally represented, and somewhere towards the end of the life cycle of the product, of the human, number decreases. In reality, this is not possible. So there may be slight variations. For example, these are now in the USA, these are in England. See small pitfalls here and here. But what is the West to us? Let's see what we have in Russia. It's something like this. Well, apart from the obvious fact that men are dying like flies dramatically after 65, and after 40 there are far more women than men, here you also see a phenomenon called the demographic pit. Here it is. What exactly is the whole point? Let's first turn the graph around to make it easier to understand. It feels feeble at the moment, but in 20 years, when this mountain of workers starts to turn into retirees, we will simply have no new workers to support these retirees and the economy as a whole. You, as viewers of our channel, already know that people are the new oil. They are the generators of all kinds of direct tax, like personal income tax and contributions to the retirement fund, and indirect ones like VAT. In other words, as the working age population declines, so will the state's budget revenues, and so will the burden on retirees. This means that the state will then either cut its spending or raise the retirement age, stop indexing pensions and freeze them, cancel welfare benefits, and most importantly, raise taxes to compensate for the decline in income. This in turn strikes even harder at purchasing power, thereby driving the economy into a long era of economic impotence. Therefore, any country should aim for a normal distribution of the three categories of population. And if the country does not aim for this, then the population will aim to another country. And in fact, it is normal for a person to look at the state as a service provider, and it is normal if a person wants to change the provider. And we get to the main question. How did we get to the demographic pit in the first place, and how many people do we need to produce to get out of it? In other words, how many children do we have to give birth to? One of the key problems in Russia in terms of demography is that for a long time there have been more people dying than being born, and in June 2021 there were 1.5 times as many dead as born. In the eyes of the statistics, it looks like this. Here you see the number of deaths, but the number of births is noticeably lower. There's a big hole in between. The bigger it is, the worse it is. You can see there have been only 5 years when these two indicators were equal during the whole existence of modern Russia. All the rest of the time, we work, so to speak, in deficit. And what do you suggest? Give birth, ladies. Give birth as much as possible. To be precise, we need a total fertility rate of 2.1. That means that on average a woman of childbearing age should give birth to 2.1 children. That being the case, in 30 to 35 years, when the working class crest starts to turn into retirees, they will be picked up by the children born today. Why today? Well, the idea is to do it right now. The working people are not getting younger every day. Meanwhile, Russia's fertility rate is in trouble. Check it out. They had the right coefficient about 60 years ago, and that's probably taking into account all the Soviet republics. And the rest of the time, they're shrinking. By the way, pay attention to the small rise after 2006. We'll come back to it. In the meantime, the Russian population is getting thinner, gentlemen, and according to Worldometer forecasts, in 30 years there will be 10 million fewer Russians, and they will be 1.4% of the total population of the Earth, down from 1.87% today. Lancet scientists are extending the negative trend to the year 2100 and say that the number of Russians will be even less than 90 million, which means that we will fall below a single percent. So, how did Russia end up in a situation where Russians start to reproduce less and less? Often the authorities blame the 90s, and there is some truth in this. Let's take a closer look at the demographics. Here is this pit, World War II, this echo of the war and the natural transition from high to low birth rates in all developed countries. Another important event happened closer to us, the second half of the 1990s, when the default occurred. With it came poverty, unpaid wages, hunger, devastation, and the deepest collapse in the population. The death rate exceeded the birth rate by a factor of 1.5. This is how Professor Oleg Madvichev of the Higher School of Economics describes the consequences of 1998.
How was it possible to have children when people were basically just trying to survive, when salaries were not paid for 6 months straight, when businesses were going bankrupt? What was there to raise and support children with? Now let's do the math. We had the 90s 25 years ago. The generation born in the 1990s is now entering its childbearing years, but this generation is thin in numbers. So, it is only natural that if there are few of these people themselves, they have significantly fewer children.
Besides, democratic and capitalist values came from the West right after the collapse of the USSR. Russians, following the example of European families, started having children after the age of 25 to 30 and were accumulating more and more savings before having a child. Then there is education, the trend towards strong, independent women, waves of feminism, awareness, self-reflection, the emergence of concepts such as abusiveness, toxic relationships. In general, the traditional ideas somehow began to lose ground. Alright, if one can't solve the issue on their own, let's ask other countries about their experience. I'm talking about migration. Every year, millions of people from the former CIS countries are sent to our country, especially from Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, but unfortunately their efforts are not enough either. Look, this is how Mother Russia grew at the expense of immigrants, and there were so many more deaths than children born. That is, for 27 years, we should say thanks to 9 million migrants. Without them, the picture would have been worse. While we can only omit the question of qualification and education of such personnel. And unlike in the United States, where people migrate to stay, Russian migration is seasonal. Russian labor migration does not involve resettlement. It's mainly seasonal workers who come to us. They come to us to send money back home rather than to settle here. And here's a little pause. Since southern ex-USSR states tend to provide most of the immigrant demographic support for Russia, which country do you think people send the most money from Russia to? You have 5 seconds to think. Say the name of that country in your head. So, the biggest favorite to receive Russian capital is Switzerland. What? And only then comes Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. This is the full list. Well, I understand that it's seasonal immigrants who send money to Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia and Azerbaijan. But I wonder what kind of immigrants send such sums to Switzerland, the US and the UK. For Russia, of course, it would be better for the money to stay inside the country because less money, less welfare, less population, less money, and it is a vicious circle. Alright, apart from money matters to all the reasons listed, we also add His Majesty COVID. So let's say it straight. No country shows a reliable number of COVID deaths, not a single one. Well, because only God knows the exact number. But regardless of the numbers the authorities report, we have one way to figure it out, and that way is called excess mortality. These two scary words combine with each other to create this uncomplicated formula. And there is a simple concept behind this unpleasant formula. We take periods, average out how people died, and then just compare them to each other. Like if from 2015 to 2019 there was an average of 100 people dying, and from 2020 to 2021 there was an average of 150, then there has to be an explanation as to why all of a sudden there are 1.5 times as many people dying. Also, this very thing will give an indirect indication of how many COVID-associated deaths the authorities have missed. Not in exact numbers and roughly, but nevertheless. For example, there was a real crackdown in Mexico where people were dying at 2 or even 2.5 times the rate. And here in Singapore, which after the lockdown and the introduction of mass vaccination was holding steady at 7%. Or Israel, which was basically the first to massively chip everybody, was able to stop the peak and went down from 40% to about 15%. So what's going on there with every Russian's main enemy, the US? They've got to be doing terrible, don't they? Well, let's see. Yes, here's a graph of the US. Yeah, it's really nasty. The number goes up to 52%. If we put Russia on top, it's the same, somewhere more and somewhere less, although with the latest data we're up sharply from the bloody Americans. Anything else interesting? Yes, these are the much-loved Russian official statistics. We cannot say that the authorities are lying. No, let's say that based on the excess mortality data, we have skepticism about the consistency between official statistics and reality. And there is skepticism about many countries, mind you. Germany, for example, seems to have undercounted 20%, Poland 190%, the US 30%, and Russia 550%. In general, one can dig into this skepticism and inconsistency of figures for a long time. We can remember how in 2020, for some reason, there was a sharp 2.4 times increase in deaths from pneumonia and not from COVID, according to the Federal Statistics Service. But the whole point can be summed up in a couple of sentences. COVID was really hitting the demographics by increasing the mortality rate. The excess death rate for the entire period was 665,097 people. And it's not even that falsification was being exposed, it's that another COVID could be coming later, and countries need to be prepared for not how to disguise the real situation, but how to deal with it. Because otherwise, the extinction of the country's population is coming. The population of countries is changing all over planet Earth in different ways and for different reasons. It is decreasing in developed countries as well due to the development of contraceptives and women's education. There is even an interesting case in Iceland with only 341,000 people of population. It is about the same as some New Orleans. Iceland is trying to increase its population via immigrants, 11% of which live there. And it is understandable. You go out with a girl and she turns out to be your cousin. Nature does not approve of such mixtures. Central Africa, on the other hand, is quite the opposite, with no education or contraceptive factors, so it is predicted that by 2050, 40% of all children on Earth will be African. Despite falling birth rates, diseases and migration, the average projection by 2100 indicates a potential population of 4.2 billion on the continent, or about 38% of the world's population. In Russia, there are many more reasons for extinction than have listed in this video, but if we try to create some general idea, Again, the economy is to blame. Just as it was the main cause of the demographic pit in the 90s, we were experiencing something similar in 2021. Remember, we were looking at the fertility rate, which has been going up rapidly since 2007, and the reason for such a rise is the maternity capital. It's a form of state support to Russian families to which a second or a third child or more was born or adopted.
The only reason for the increase in the birth rate of third children was the introduction of the 450,000 ruble payment for a mortgage. The birth rate of second children has also stopped falling and has slightly increased due to the increase in the federal subsidies for multiple child families from 483,000 to 639,000 rubles.
Yes, the allocation of money has some effect, but it is not a systematic approach. Firstly, we have not touched the conditions in which this child appears at all. That is, the level of education and the level of income of the parents. And believe me, I'm not saying that all parents should have academic degrees, 2 businesses and 4 cars. All I'm saying is that if a one-time payment of 500,000 rubles, which is like $6,500, is the decisive, I emphasize here, the decisive factor for a parent to conceive a child, then I have serious doubts about the family's favorable conditions. Secondly, even with good education and income, there is a downward trend in the birth rate. You just have to look at the birth rates in rural and urban areas. Look at it. City dwellers are giving birth 40% less often. In traditional agrarian societies, children were seen as an additional labor force on the farm, so having children made economic sense. Also, having a large number of children was a guarantee of reproduction in the context of a relatively high infant mortality rate. Thirdly, the birth rate could now stimulate confidence in the future. In the meantime, all we are sure of is that prices will rise in the shops and some person will be recognized as a foreign agent for having an alternative point of view. After all, the right one sounds something like this.
После революции 1917 года Российская империя прекратила свое существование, а потом произошло еще и крушение Советского Союза. Если бы они не произошли, у нас была бы другая страна. Население было бы сейчас под 500 миллионов человек. Если бы этих трагедий не было, было бы около 500 миллионов человек.
Although more than 30 years have passed since the last such event, that is the collapse of the USSR, and in 30 years Russia's population has only shrunk and continues to shrink both quantitatively and in relation to the world population from 2.6% to 1.9%. A vicious circle emerges. The richer and more developed a country is, the richer and more developed it needs to be in order to continue to be rich and developed. After all, from a certain level of prosperity, people start looking for even higher prosperity. The threshold for having more children, so to speak, is raised. The subject of demography itself is very complex. There are no direct correlations. Underdeveloped and poor countries have growing populations due to lack of education, contraception, consumer economics. But when culture and education appear, people start to think about the sufficiency of economic goods to produce offspring. Will the child be able to live better than the parents? When this need is closed as well, confidence in the future appears, and with it comes the quintessential question of whether I need a child at all, and what for? Maybe I'll get a cat instead. In addition to personal questions, there are global ones as well. When the world's population reaches 11 billion, what will be the composition of that population? What is the proportion of educated and not so educated, the rich and the poor? Will there be enough jobs and resources for everyone? It turns out that behind the boring word demography, there are a lot of interesting Pandora's boxes, quite a few immoral and unethical ones at that. And now we're finishing this video in which we've talked only about the situation prior to the war. Do you wonder how the demographic picture has changed in the current reality? Write your thoughts about it in the comments. We say a big thank you to our Patreon supporters for staying with us. You know who to share this video with, and I'm the researcher.